Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 604, The Bureaucrats, Part 3. Longer ago than I care to admit, I walked into my first class of my first day of graduate school for my master's. There were 5 of us in my master's cohort, and I imagine in retrospect we were all pretty nervous. I know I was. And of course, most of my memory of that day involved desperately trying to impress my colleagues by sounding like I knew what I was talking about. Possibly I even succeeded, I suppose you'd have to ask them. Of course, the other thing I remember very clearly is how surprised I was at the first piece of reading we were assigned. I forget the precise name of this class. It was, in essence, Intro to Learning About Japan Now That You're in Grad School, but with a pithier title. And I was really excited to find out which book we'd be starting with, some sweeping, brilliant vision that would radically transform my understanding of a region I was hungry to learn more about, doubtless. So I was a bit surprised when we were told that for our first actual seminar class, we would be reading a somewhat dry-sounding book about the bureaucracy, Meaty and the Japanese Miracle. Now there was a lot I didn't know about this book going into it. Probably in retrospect, the most important thing I could have known was that the author, Dr. Chalmers Johnson, was the PhD supervisor for Dr. Marie Ancherdogi, who was teaching us in this intro class. In a lot of ways, that's academia. I'm not saying Dr. Ancherdogi picked the book for us because of her relationship to Dr. Chalmers Johnson, since Meaty and the Japanese Miracle is pretty well known independently of that, and she did not present the book uncritically, though we'll get more into that when we talk about what it has to say. Still, that realization was interesting for me in terms of allowing me to see how much those kind of individual connections define academia in the way that they don't necessarily at the lower levels of higher education. But that wasn't why Dr. Ancherdogi picked this book for us. She did it because Dr. Johnson's basic point in Meaty and the Japanese Miracle was very provocative and influential. Japan, after World War II, was, according to Chalmers Johnson, not a democracy. Or at least, not a real one. His core contention was that the real power holders in Japan were not the elected politicians who governed in the Diet building. Those were figureheads. Real political power was held by Japan's unelected elite, the bureaucrats. In another essay for the Journal of Japanese Studies, Johnson would put this even more explicitly, borrowing the language of the post-war political scientist Maruyama Masao. Maruyama dedicated his career to understanding the fascist era of Japanese politics and argued that there were 3 basic sources of political power in the Japanese fascist system. He called these the mikoshi, the portable shrine used in Shinto ceremonies, which represented authority or legitimacy, the official, which represented decision-making power, and the ronin, the outlaw, representing violence. And Johnson, quoting another Japanese political scientist, Nagai Yonosuke, explicitly endorsed the idea that Maruyama's 3-part division applied to post-war Japan too. Quote, he, Nagai, suggests that today the portable shrine is the Liberal Democratic Party faction leader, held aloft by the bureaucracy, and prodded by the new ronin, the press, and he might have added, the emerging forces of consumer protest. In other words, the LDP were figureheads, the press were essentially the enforcers keeping everyone in line, presumably by threatening to humiliate them, now that it was harder to get away with stabbing people than it had been before 1945, and that left the bureaucracy as the officials, the ones with actual power. And after some jargon-laden pontification, after all, still an academic essay, Johnson noted that this third of Maruyama's symbols, the official, was fairly under-discussed in English. Which was unusual because, quote, the bureaucracy does not rule in a vacuum in Japan, but it does hold an ascendant position, and is likely to continue to do so. Now, Chalmers Johnson's academic arguments on this subject span at least 2 books and a host of articles that I know of, so there is no way I'm going to do them justice here. Instead, here is my effort to summarize as best as I can why he believed the bureaucracy were the real power holders of post-war Japan. Now, first things first, Johnson did not argue that the whole bureaucracy collectively ran the country. Nobody, so far as I know, was going out there trying to argue that the Ministry of Forestry, Agriculture, and Fisheries secretly ran the government. Instead, Johnson argued that a few specific wings of the bureaucracy had been able to garner a lot of decision-making power in Japan during the Second World War. In particular, bureaucrats in the finance ministry and what was then called the Ministry of Commerce and Industry had allied themselves to the country's militarist rulers, as opposed to, say, the foreign ministry, which had opposed them. The economic bureaucrats helped organize Japan for war in exchange for the military's support in being able to implement policies that gave them much more direct control over the economy. After the war, in turn, the course of the occupation we covered last week meant the military leadership was purged. The Zaibatsu megacorporations were reformed and weakened into the modern keiretsu as well, but the bureaucratic leadership was largely, as we saw, not touched. And to make matters worse, the Americans handed power over to an elected representative government composed largely of people without that much experience actually governing, because the elected representatives of Japan had never really had that much power under the 1947 Constitution and had, at any rate, been totally sidelined since the 1930s. Indeed, the few politicians after 1945 who did have some experience actually governing tended to come from, you guessed it, the bureaucracy. Many of them were retired bureaucrats like Yoshida Shigeru, who shepherded the post-war Liberal Party and served as prime minister from 1946 to 47, and again from 1948 to 1954. When Yoshida retired and his Liberal Party merged with the other mainstream conservative party, the Democrats, to form the Liberal Democratic Party, what emerged was a party that was dominated largely by retired bureaucrats. There were factions within the LDP, as it's called for short, made up of politicians who'd never held a bureaucratic job, but the leadership of the party and its most important sub-factions tended to be dominated by ex-bureaucrats who still had comfortable connections to their old offices. By the 1960s, Johnson noted that pattern had started to dilute somewhat, but even so, a huge chunk of the Liberal Democratic Party, which from the time it was founded until 1993 never lost an election, was made up of former bureaucrats. Johnson found that by 1970, 69 members out of 486 total representatives in the House of Representatives, and 50 out of 250 in the House of Councilors, had spent some time in the bureaucracy. Given that situation, it only made sense that the bureaucracy would come to dominate a political class that was largely reliant on it for expertise in governing, particularly when it came to the most important issue of post-war Japan, the economy and how to actually, feed the country and employ it or whatever. Given that situation, it was the economic bureaucracy, in particular the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, which was formed out of the old Ministry of Commerce and Industry, that tended to dominate decision-making, at least according to Chalmers Johnson. Hence the book title, MITI and the Japanese Miracle, which makes it pretty clear who Johnson thought was responsible for the rebirth of the Japanese economy after World War II. Moreover, Johnson noted that whatever the democratic reforms of the occupation era, the actual attitude of Japan's governing bureaucracy had not changed that much. He quotes at length from a 1973 public opinion survey on the bureaucracy asking a sample of 2,445 people about their experiences with the national bureaucracy. 67.9% reported having some level of dealing with the bureaucracy in their daily lives, so relatively frequently. The vast majority with the local levels of said bureaucracy. Specifically, 60.6% had worked with a prefectural bureaucrat, 4.1% with a regional one, and 3.2% with a national level bureaucrat. Because all bureaucratic ministries were run centrally out of Tokyo, they're not like different prefectural level ones like you would have state versus federal bureaucracy in the US. You can think of this like seniority. Most people are engaging with lower level bureaucrats who are working in prefectural offices before they get promoted to higher level ones back in Tokyo. Now things get really interesting when he reports on what people had to say about their experiences. Quote, when asked to state what image they held of the bureaucracy in which no preset choice was offered, but all answers were recorded, some 20.2% replied the bureaucracy was majime, serious, 20.5% used the word katai, hard, 9.2% said ohe, arrogant, 12.7 said noritsu ga warui, inefficient. 16.4% included the phrase yuzu ga kikanai, unadaptable. 14.4% thought the bureaucracy lacked a feeling of service, sabisu kokoro ga nai. A mere 12.5% thought bureaucrats were shinsetsu, friendly. By a ratio of 35.2% to 19%, more people thought the bureaucrats' abilities were on balance superior to average people than inferior. So what does that mean? Well, as I read it at least, it shows that the attitude of Japanese bureaucrats, the elitism, the arrogance, hadn't really changed that much, and that, moreover, they were apparently pretty convincing, because at least a decent number of people did believe they were just fundamentally the nation's elite. Johnson offers a whole host of evidence in his writing to support the idea that the bureaucracy really does the governing in Japan. Probably his most consistently referenced idea is that most of the legislation passed by the Diet in its annual sessions during the post-war years was drafted by bureaucrats in the relevant industries and then submitted to the Prime Minister's cabinet, which then usually passed it along to the Diet without comment or modification. Even things like the annual budget were drafted entirely by the Finance Ministry, not by any committee of the National Diet, and then just handed to legislators to approve. To give some hard numbers here, in 1958, the cabinet introduced 175 bills. In other words, these were bills that originated in the Prime Minister's office in some way. Someone in the Prime Minister's cabinet decided they were necessary. So far as Johnson could find, all of those were written by bureaucrats, and 145 of them were passed. By comparison, only 68 bills that year originated within the House of Representatives itself, in other words, they were actually written by legislators, and only 15 of those actually passed. Johnson also noted that the theoretical checks on the bureaucracy, most notably in the form of the shingikai or deliberation councils, mechanisms for civilian input for non-bureaucrats to advise on policy matters, were basically a fig leaf. The leaders of specific ministries, say the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, got to pick whichever experts they wanted to weigh in on their policies, so as you might imagine, they just handpicked their preferred experts, and quite a few ministry bureaucrats were pretty open with the press about the fact that the councils were just intended to head off critiques of the bureaucracy as autocratic by giving some appearance of external input. The bureaucracy was also linked to big business through a process called amakudari, roughly the descent from heaven. This was a system whereby bureaucrats would take an early retirement around age 50 and then move into cushy gigs at major firms, essentially as highly paid consultants. The civil service laws imposed by the Americans did impose a 5-year cooldown for bureaucrats before they could take a job in a closely related industry, but that law also gave the National Personnel Agency, which oversaw the bureaucracy, the right to grant exemptions on that rule, and they were pretty free with those exemptions. The role of amakudari, according to Chalmers Johnson, was twofold. First, it was a carrot held out to bureaucrats. Even if the prestige was good, the pay wasn't necessarily. But those amakudari consultancies were generally very well paid. Second, the system was very helpful for reinforcing ties between the bureaucracy and business by ensuring the bureaucracy had a voice not just in regulating big business, but in leading it. Unsurprisingly, the Finance Ministry and Ministry of International Commerce and Industry were the main culprits for amakudari jobs. For reference, in 1973, the National Personnel Agency approved 33 amakudari requests for the Finance Ministry and 32 for MITI, compared to just, as an example, 6 for the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications, 3 for the Ministry of Health and Welfare. According to Chalmers Johnson, all this created a sort of third system in Japan between the two extremes of the Cold War, the laissez-faire hands-off capitalism of America and the planned, centralized government-directed economies of the Soviet Union and other Marxist states. As an aside, I do have to note that those characterizations themselves are kind of unfair. The US has never had a totally unregulated economy, and trade and market forces did still operate in most Marxist states, just in a more controlled way, but I digress. Anyway, according to Johnson, the Japanese system was a sort of midpoint that he called developmental capitalism, or the developmental state. Market forces were allowed to operate, but not in an unrestrained way that was intended to produce the most effective competition for economic efficiency. Instead, those forces were guided by state directives. The goal was not a strong economy necessarily, but an economy that served the national interest, well-being, and national security. One American observer described the resulting situation by analogy. In the US, he said government bureaucrats operated in a role like that of an umpire in a baseball game, calling the strikes and balls, ensuring everyone played fairly and by the rules. In Japan, meanwhile, government bureaucrats were not the umpires, they were players on the field, not at all impartial, and very much with their own agendas. Hoshino Shinyasu, the former head of the economic planning agency of MITI, put it a bit more succinctly in a talk he gave to Russian economists in 1992, quote, "The post-war Japanese approach was something close to a planned economy, not true capitalism, but capitalism under strict control. In a country like Japan, non-transparent rules are accepted in the belief that their purport is understood implicitly. Non-transparent methods, such as the Japanese government's administrative guidance, would have been regarded as unfair outside of Japan and most likely could not function in the United States. In the American model, emphasis is placed on the method of competition among equally powerful industries, while Japan has been emphasizing an industrial policy of shifting comparative advantage." As an aside, what that means, comparative advantage, is basically just whether or not a company can offer something at a lower price than another producer. What he's saying is the bureaucracy picks who they think has the best comparative advantage and essentially helps them win. So, to summarize, Chalmers-Johnson saw Japan as essentially a bureaucratic state where the bureaucracy, especially the economic bureaucracy, made most of the important decisions, even if it didn't necessarily totally dominate politics. The Amakudari system, the bureaucracy's connections with the LDP, and their regulatory powers over the economy, especially big business, made the bureaucracy the guiding force of post-war Japan and in turn enabled Japan's post-war economic miracle. That miracle would see Japan go from abject poverty to the second wealthiest nation on the planet in just about 30 years. And that theory would in turn suggest the post-war bureaucracy in Japan didn't change all that much in its scope, powers, and most importantly internal culture compared to pre-war Japan. The same elitist attitudes predominated despite the post-war reforms of the occupation, which were really more of a fig leaf according to Johnson than anything else. All the occupation really did, he contended, was remove the other major players of the pre-war government, the military and the zaibatsu, from positions of power. Since the bureaucracy remained relatively untouched and its two biggest competitors were basically gone, it made sense the bureaucracy would dominate the post-war state. But of course, as we've seen, this is academic history, and there's no position in academia someone isn't prepared to argue against. Particularly in the last few decades, there's been a new wave of scholarship questioning some of Johnson's contentions around the extent to which Japan was really governed by the bureaucracy in the post-war era. For a start, there's one story critics of Johnson always like to highlight. That story begins in 1953 when a pair of audio engineers named Ibuka Masaru and Morita Akio began working on a hot new invention, a transistor radio. Specifically, the two wanted to build a radio using transistor technology developed at Bell Labs in New Jersey. Those transistors would allow for a smaller, more efficient and portable radio than had previously been possible, for physics-related reasons that I am utterly unqualified to explain. Morita and Ibuka could get that license. Bell, like all American companies, had instructions from the US government to license its patents on the cheap to Japanese companies as part of a Cold War strategy to revive the Japanese economy. Japan could hardly be a bastion against the Red Menace without a strong economy of its own, and besides, what was the harm? If you'd told any American official in 1953 that the Japanese economy had the potential to become a major competitor to America in just a few decades, you would have been laughed out of the room. But there was one impediment in the way of Morita and Ibuka: MITI. The Bell transistor patent was cheap, $35,000, today about $472,000 US, so not chump change, but also as business expenses went, not hideous. but Miti had very strict rules about overseas capital exchanges. Miti bureaucrats were very worried that Japanese money being spent overseas and not domestically had the potential to undercut the Japanese economy. They put into place strict capital controls to ensure any money being spent benefited Japan's own economy as much as possible rather than an overseas firm. So if you wanted to buy literally anything for commercial purposes from overseas, you needed a permit from Miti, and when Morita and Ibuka asked for one, they were told to shove off. Miti bureaucrats told them their transistor radio was not worth the cost of that much money leaving the Japanese economy, instead of being spent within Japan proper where it could create jobs and prosperity. Ibuka and Morita had to lobby for 2 straight years to convince Miti's leadership to change their minds. Eventually, they were able to do so, as by 1955, Miti's leadership felt the economic position of Japan was secure enough to loosen its capital controls a bit. The two men bought the patent and built the TR-55 transistor radio. They also, with an eye towards overseas export, decided to change their company name away from Tokyo Tsushin Kogyo, Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation, to something that would be easier for non-Japanese to remember and pronounce. The T-55 was the first product to bear their new corporate name, Sony. And of course, the TR-55 would build a business empire that would eventually spread everywhere from video games to photography to audio engineering and beyond, and become one of the most important companies in the entire world in the process. And let's be clear here, Miti bureaucrats almost canned the whole damn idea. If those initial bureaucrats had gotten their way, Sony would never exist. They were so focused on engineering the existing corporations in Japan with their economic policies, protecting the domestic market dominated by firms like Matsushita, what's now Panasonic, and Mitsubishi, that they almost prevented the rise of a new, incredibly important corporation that has done a lot for Japan's economy. So the basic argument here is, how can Miti possibly deserve credit for Japan's post-war economic boom if they almost screwed the pooch, so to speak, that badly? Of course, that's also not the only argument against the Miti ran the country position, even if it is one of the more dramatic. For a start, Miti bureaucrats almost made that exact same mistake a decade later. In the mid-50s, Miti bureaucrats targeted one of the growing consumer sectors in Japan which they felt had too many competitors within it. There were too many companies competing for not enough market share, and they were just clearly going to cannibalize each other's businesses and then drive each other out of business. So Miti bureaucrats, in their wisdom, decided to intervene, because of course, they knew better. In the late 50s, they tried to force these two companies to compete. Each would produce a prototype, Miti would designate a winner, and that company would have government support to build up the domestic industry. The loser would pull out of this market altogether. A few years later, Miti bureaucrats tried to force merger talks between these companies. If you're noticing I'm being a bit obtuse about naming the companies in the field they were competing in, that is of course in service of the dramatic reveal. The field was automobile manufacturing. The two companies that couldn't possibly both survive were Nissan and Honda. Both times their corporate leadership refused to listen to Miti's dictates, and of course both companies turned out very successful and were able to compete in both Japan and overseas without driving each other out of business. Turns out there was enough interest. Critics further note that from 1955 to 1973, Miti issued a series of 6 national economic plans forecasting a vision for Japan's economic growth, and every single time, Miti's forecast for national economic growth was substantially under Japan's actual growth rate. That suggests Miti didn't actually have a very good handle on what was causing Japan's economy to grow that quickly, if they couldn't even ballpark estimate it very well. There's also the fact that much of the financial support Miti directed to companies, usually by way of influencing the loans of the Japan Development Bank, went to sectors that weren't actually profitable. For example, between 1953 and 55, 83% of Japan Development Bank loans went to one of 4 sectors: electric generation, coal, steel, and shipbuilding. None of those fields were able to turn a profit then or in the decades since. To be honest, though, I've always thought this was a pretty weak argument that Meaty's economic policies weren't good. I present it only for reasons of completionism. So far as I know, no Meaty official ever considered those investments profit-driven. They were about deliberately taking a loss on necessary infrastructure for the rest of the economy. For example, you need steel to build rail lines to carry products, ships to send things overseas. It's a far better argument, in my opinion, that when you actually look at the historical record, it's the politicians who did the most important job in creating the post-war economic miracle, actually getting buy-in from Japan's populace. Most central here, of course, was Ikeda Hayato, the prime minister who took over in the summer of 1960 after the disastrous nationwide riots and protests against the renewal of the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty. Ikeda was initially a bureaucrat, but by 1960 he'd been in politics for a decade, and his main accomplishments in his career were political. He was able, by means of effective messaging, to sell a country that was very divided on questions like, how do we remember World War II? What should our relationship with the US be? On laying those questions aside and focusing on just one. How do we make Japan as rich as possible as quickly as possible? Within the LDP, he was able to convince the ruling Conservative Party's wide-ranging factions to coalesce around that goal, including a few factions that had been debating splitting off from the LDP, which would have jeopardized their ability to actually run the country. Externally, he was able to project the image of a popular leader. He was able to work effectively with the opposition socialists and promote compromise. He worked very hard to project an image as an everyday man of the people. I'll quote here from historian Nick Kapoor, quote, beginning with his appearance, he, Ikeda, switched from the severe wire-rimmed glasses he'd always worn to a more casual plastic-rimmed set, and from his habitual double-breasted suit to a single-breasted one. He proclaimed his love of curry rice, the no-frills comfort food of the masses, and upon taking office he publicly promised to refrain from golf or geisha parties, promises he assiduously kept until his resignation 4 years later. In a 1961 New Year's Day interview with the Sankei Shimbun, Ikeda declared, quote, ultimately I'm just another ordinary working stiff. Somehow someone like me wound up getting entrusted with the fate of 90 million Japanese people. I keenly feel the almost crushing weight of this grave responsibility. That image, that ability to play politics well, convinced the people of Japan to support Ikeda's vision of rebuilding the economy above all else. And of course, that did become an easier sell when it worked really well and everyone started to get much richer. Very little of this success, in turn, had to do with the economic bureaucracy, who certainly implemented Ikeda's vision and sent advisors to help him craft it, but Ikeda had always been the mastermind of a vision of Japan as a post-war mercantile power. This is why, personally, I think the argument that the bureaucracy deserves the credit for post-war Japan's revival, the argument that's implicit in the title, Meaty and the Japanese Miracle, is kind of flawed. Meaty bureaucrats certainly talked like they invented post-war Japan. Chalmers Johnson quotes at great length from some of their books, retired post-war bureaucrats who described this romantic culture of long nights, hard partying to let off the stress, tense decision-making about how to implement policy, and above all, the certainty that only they, as the elite, had the vision to see things through. But I mean, of course they'd say that, right? Those memoirs are indicative of what we talked about last week, the elitism and self-assuredness of the bureaucracy, which definitely hadn't changed, but it didn't mean the bureaucracy actually created the Japanese miracle. So that's essentially how we got to where we are today, or at least most of the way there. I think it's fair to say the Japanese bureaucracy is the part of the Japanese government that remains the most unchanged from before the Second World War. The terminology has changed. The old ranking system is gone, replaced with a simplified one, in which there are 3 levels based on the examinations you take, first, second, or third grade exams, with the first being equivalent to the old higher civil service exam. The exams are also a little different. They're more technical than they were, and there's no longer this assumption that anyone in the bureaucracy at the high levels should be a generalist. But those are technical, operational details, and in my experience, the attitude, the internal culture, hasn't really changed. And I mean, it makes sense. It's very hard to get a job in the national bureaucracy. You need to be well positioned for the exams and have good grades, and, because it still helps you to get noticed among everyone with good exam scores, have good connections. All that means going to a good college. That requires scoring well on college entrance exams, which requires doing well in high school, which means having the wealth and academic aptitude and support to get good grades. Usually that involves a lot of extra tutoring, a lot of long days. Very few people can pull this off. It's not surprising that those that can would be a little bit, frankly, full of themselves. And of course, once you make it into a job in the bureaucracy, those positions remain as siloed from each other as they ever have been. That culture of each ministry carving off its own little fiefdom and refusing to work with the others probably contributed to the single biggest shock to hit the bureaucracy since the occupation, and one from which, in many ways, it has not recovered. Because, of course, the golden age of the Japanese economic miracle, which Chalmers Johnson credited Meaty and the rest of the state bureaucracy with, did eventually come to an end, and in many ways, that was the bureaucracy's fault. As a reminder, Japan's post-war economic miracle came to an end in the early 90s with the collapse of a massively overinflated asset bubble centered on real estate that basically crashed the entire Japanese economy. A lot of people deserve some blame for the whole fiasco, from banks that gave out loans way too freely for buying real estate, to businesses that did a very poor job diversifying their holdings. But indisputably, Japan's economic bureaucrats in particular really messed things up during the 80s and 90s and let things get much worse than they could have been. Most obviously and immediately, infighting between the Bank of Japan and Ministry of Finance over whether or not Japan's real estate bubble actually was overinflated and needed correction delayed any actual decision-making on that subject even after the alarm was first raised. That infighting was based more on bureaucratic proceduralism, worries about the other side horning in on our territory, than actual policy disagreements. And of course, the asset bubble itself had been driven by a shift in economic policy that had been forced by the Americans, by the Plaza Accord, a deal that was intended to restrict Japanese competition on the American market. That competition on the American market had been a focal point of Meaty planning in particular, and Meaty bureaucrats had never factored into their vision that Japanese competition would provoke an angry response from the United States. So it's not that surprising the bureaucracy ate a lot of blame for the asset bubble, and in many ways its reputation has never recovered. To put it another way, people were willing to put up with bureaucratic elitists because those elitists before 1990 were plausibly contributing to a system that made everyone richer. These days, maybe that cover isn't there quite in the same way. So we have seen a host of reforms in the last 30 years intended to rein in Japan's bureaucracy, all of them generally aimed at stripping away a lot of the independence it used to enjoy and creating more central direction under the control of actual elected officials. The biggest piece of that reform was almost certainly the central government reforms of 2001 put in place by the LDP powerhouse Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro. Koizumi took the 22 bureaucratic ministries and merged them down to 12 plus one cabinet office. He outright eliminated the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. Again, these were some structural reforms, but not really cultural ones. How much has the elitist attitude of the bureaucracy changed? I actually find it hard to say. Speaking personally, I only ever knew people in the defense ministry, and because of Article 9 and Japan's unique history around the whole self-defense forces, they kind of have their own different culture over there. Of course, the bureaucracy also suffers from the same problem that has plagued Japan since 1991. Excepting Koizumi Junichiro and Abe Shinzo, there hasn't really been one leader talented enough or even able to stay in office long enough to put into place a consistent vision on how to fix post-bubble Japan. Looking back at its history, Japan's governing bureaucracy has a very unique history compared to America or anywhere else I know of in the Western world. As an institution, and as an idea for how government should work, it has roots going back further than anything except the imperial throne in Japan's own history. And that does make it very unique and help explain some different aspects of how the Japanese political order works compared to other democracies. But looking back on it, I think the thing I'm noticing the most is just how human the bureaucracy is. Bureaucrats have this elitist reputation in Japan, but ironically that attitude is proof that they're not different from most people. Just as susceptible to egotism and arrogance, just as easily blinded by those things, into, for example, making foolish alliances with militarists, or failing to see the obvious problems with Japan's asset bubble in the 80s. Maybe that's the real lesson of Japan's bureaucratic history. It's natural to want to promote people on merit, to think about rational management, wanting to put the best of the best in charge. But in the end, the best of the best can never really be chosen in any objective way, and whoever we pick, they're only going to be human. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for a new series on Japan's colonization of Manchuria.